Thank you both for very stimulating presentations and for ending us on a high note. As we had a lot of things yesterday that were fairly discouraging in terms of impacts. But a couple of things. I will start with a question, and I hope people will form a line with the mics. We ought to have some spirited discussion here. A couple of things that hit me with the statistics and the potential that David, that you ended up in with the potential for increased production if we did a much better job of managing marine protein or fish production, both fisheries and aquaculture. But before I get there, Steve outlined the imports and the exports, the imports of fish products, seafood, and the exports of grain, and I hadn't looked at those simultaneously. I've seen both of them separately, but not simultaneously. I was wondering about, do we really end up taking protein away? Does the U.S. end up taking protein away from other places in the world that need that protein, and then in turn we're forcing a substitution of a less valuable food product with carbohydrates or other things. So I think that's a fundamental question for us to think about, and with the population issues that David outlined, how those population growth, even with increased production, might affect. Can we still continue to import as much, I guess, is the bottom line, and what the collateral damage of that might be on human health. So both of you want to take a shot?
So I'll try to address Paul's initial question about protein deficits. I think there are examples where that is the case, that a substantial fraction of the extant traditional protein source has been converted to export income. What the driving force here, of course, is that what levels of society are benefiting from that export income. In many of the places where this is the most problematic, particularly in Africa, there are strata in society that are benefiting from this, but it's not actually feeding back in terms of the entirety of the population. And so in particular, there's some Central African countries where, for example, the production of Nile perch, which is a large predatory fish in the African Rift Lakes, is going to Europe, and then the protein sources available there are insufficient, and the income from the exports is not getting back to do this. And so one has to be mindful not only of what the food aid is actually trying to make up for in terms of the balance of this, but also the distribution of those incomes for things like importing grain. So it is problematic. I would say there's two sides to every coin, and many of the countries that the U.S. is importing from, like for example Vietnam, they're converting that back into cash that's benefiting that society in substantial ways. So it's hard to actually label that as a problem everywhere in the world, but certainly it can be.
Let's move on. Ed Laws, you have a question?
Okay, I have a question for both Steve and David. Steve, I think you mentioned that current aquaculture production is 48 million tons. And I recall some years ago, John Bardock and others estimating the potential to be 20 million tons, so we're up to 48. Do we think 48 million tons is sustainable? If you do a life cycle analysis on aquaculture, is that 48 million tons a year sustainable? And if it is, how far can we push it in a sustainable way? And then David, one issue you didn't mention was irrigation and the use of groundwater for irrigation. I know northern China is basically pumping the ground dry, and there's a lot of overdrafting going on in the western part of the U.S. Do you see a solution to that? And it's not sustainable, clearly. So I think the Chinese are feeding several hundred million people a year based on irrigation practices that are not sustainable.
You go first.
Okay. Is aquaculture sustainable? Sure. Is aquaculture sustainable? I'd defer to my colleague Kevin, certainly to answer this one. Let me just give some thoughts on it. The vast majority of aquaculture production in the world comes from China, and it's freshwater production. They also are involved in mariculture production on an industrial scale. And so if one looks at many of the bays and estuaries in China, you know, they might as well be an industrial park for aquaculture. And so that actually means that in use of that space, that you're pushing out other ecosystem services, and particularly ones that we value in the United States, you know, view shed, recreation, and other things. Sure, it can work on that scale. The real question is going to be, what are you feeding the aquaculture products? If it's agriculture, then you have all the attendant problems that David talked about in terms of, you know, the supply. The problem with feeding only an agriculture-based diet are you don't get all the health benefits necessarily that you get from omega-3s that are primarily being derived from fish. And so feeding fish to fish, there's lots of research that's going on, you know, in order to try to see if you can break those components down, and a lot of change in practices to do things like use a finishing diet high in animal protein right at the end to jump up the production of omega-3s. But still, there are, I guess it's a long way of saying, I don't know.
I will, on the sustainability of food production, there are many aspects of global food production that are not really sustainable, and water is one of the big issues. China, about 11% of the land area of China is suitable for agriculture. They're using 13% of it right now. And they're a country with vast areas of very dry land, which they're trying to farm, so they are definitely using up groundwater, and that is not sustainable. We have the same thing happen in the United States with high corn prices, where corn production has been moved further west, is being fed by aquifers that are not being recharged at a rate that are being drawn down. So it is an issue. There are many nations around the world that have very low yields, but have good climate, good rainfall, good soils, and so on. But where the farmers don't have any capital to do modern farming, they have almost no knowledge. They have a political unrest that makes their nations and so on be very unstable. And I think that the hope I have in addition to things I talked about today, the hope I have for sustainably meeting global food demand is that these poor nations of the world with what's called a large yield gap, where their yields are about a fifth of what they could be on rain-fed lands, that we can find a way around to have these lands become much more productive. And if they can do that, that'll get rid of, we could meet 70 of the 100% of the food demand that we have coming, 70% of it, purely by the increased yields on those lands without need for irrigating them and so on. So there are places where we can have sustainable agriculture in the world, but right now there are nations where the infrastructure, the knowledge, the capital isn't there.
Bernie?
Thanks, Bernie Goldstein, roundtable member. It's as much a comment as a question about the life cycle analysis and these other sustainability tools. And what you've shown is something that's clearly come a long way in terms of being able to be useful. It's really important to have these tools. But you also yourself pointed out just recently, which made me think about the Central African areas and maybe where the funds go. And is that part of the sustainability analysis, part of life cycle analysis? How do we do that better? There's another one of a paper in Science about 10 years ago where overfishing off the west coast of Africa is seen to increase the amount of bushmeat used, killing by folks. The concern there is an endangered species issue. That's an all or none thing. The species is gone or isn't gone because people are out there hunting these various species that they wouldn't be otherwise if the price of fish wasn't up. There's even a further if you will, go one ring further from that, there's a whole literature on where the next emerging infection is going to come from. A concern is obviously primate-adapted viruses or bacteria that, and if you look at bushmeat killing, you see the pictures of it, you see basically people butchering these monkeys they've just killed in the field. There's blood all over the place, the human hand, the machete's right there. So now you're looking at, wow, there's a low probability, but if it were to occur, the impact of another next HIV or something is enormous. How do you incorporate those things into life cycle analysis? And let me make maybe a suggestion. As risk assessment developed in the 80s, the value of risk assessment forum within EPA, interagency within the U.S. government, the OECD harmonization of risk approaches really made a very big difference in that people around the world were now starting to use things in the same way. And also it allowed them to approach issues that are on the borders, such as the ones that I just raised. Is there an opportunity to do that with life cycle analysis? Are there folks getting together and sort of harmonizing, if you will, the approaches, thinking about the frontiers of where can we go next to really incorporate these important considerations into life cycle analysis?
That's a really thoughtful approach to this, and that is, starting from some basic metrics. How much of many of the diverse societal goals that we have can we incorporate in a decision-making process and not have it totally unwieldy in terms of actually trying to do this. And, it's really interesting because the sort of classic fisheries metrics are that, that grid that I showed, how big is the stock, how fast is it leaving? And that's the sustainability measure that FAO is looking at in terms of the world sustainability issues in Johannesburg and others. But then we also see these management issues of the transition costs basically bringing in a whole variety of other metrics. So in the United States, not only do we have preventing overfishing as a metric, but we have 9 other national standards, which gets to things like reductions in bycatch, economic efficiency, balance between the states, impact on coastal communities. So what you've done is layered a number of dimensions into that. It's going to be really interesting to see if we get some commonality of those kinds of metrics at the global scale as well, because 90% of the world's stocks don't even have the basic overfishing metric, as opposed to some of these other issues. But that being said, some of these issues about income disparity and impacts on the developing world, one could think about using development tools that to basically as incentives to incorporate some of those things into fisheries management. So, for example, the World Bank allocation of funds, it could be based on the fact that you're keeping local production in country, those kinds of things. So one could imagine a broader set of non-regulatory controls that would have these positive impacts. And the reason I say that is these consumer-based metrics are actually becoming as dominant as the regulatory metrics, of top-down control. And so I think, it's a question of who's got some skin in the game that's willing to actually support it.
Richard?
In the regulatory world and the scientific world, we're very good at doing the micro zoom level, and oftentimes it's interesting to look at the wide-angle lens. We didn't talk about the dead zone, really, and the Gulf of Mexico, and the enormous loss of both livelihood and good, nutritious food, 7,000 square miles, essentially dead good part of the year. Partly it's nitrates coming down the Mississippi River, but it's in part atrazine and a series of herbicides which directly affect the very bottom of the food chain, the food web there. We have spent on an average $14 billion a year of taxpayers' money on price supports for 6 commodities, the big one being corn, and 40% of all of our corn feeds livestock, as you've correctly pointed out. About another 40% goes to ethanol, which with a net really negative, or at least non-contributory impact on this. We've got the entire state of Iowa, which is a wonderful agricultural state, essentially would go hungry in 3 days if they couldn't import fruits and vegetables, because all they grow at this point are these commodity crops. And at this time, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not by much, every child in the Midwestern United States is drinking nitrogen or nitrate in their water, groundwater and surface water, at least at some level, because of how we're growing our food. And every child's got atrazine, perhaps some of the other herbicides, in their water in the entire. And when we look at the broad spectrum of human health potential and real impacts, I think these roundtables got to really begin to think more seriously about some of these systems issues that are really profound, especially as we look forward for future generations.
The simple comment is I agree totally. And I think you didn't mention, but I'm sure you know, that nitrogen fertilizer with the ammonium creates PM 2.5 at very high levels, which also impacts human health. So there are things even beyond that that aren't quite so obvious. And one might argue that the environmental costs are to some extent acceptable when we're providing food that really is keeping people alive. But when we're providing an alternative fuel that for a vehicle that actually has greater environmental harm than gasoline, which was hard to do. We came up with one that did it. Then I would agree with you that we are really going in the wrong direction.
Jack? You shared some, I think, some startling information, although I was aware of some of it. I never focused on it until you started to present this, Dave, about the greenhouse gas impact of agriculture in all its capacity. And I'm thinking, I'm on this task force at Harvard to look at the reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions, and we look at scope 1 and scope 2, and we think we're doing such a great job with our buildings and trying to squeeze this down to 20% reductions and 30% reductions. And yet, I think we serve something like 50,000 meals a day on this campus for all the staff and students, and that's just, maybe they eat off campus too. But does scope 3, we're talking about scope 3 where you try to get, well, this is getting vendors and getting transportation in the equations of your footprint, but it would seem to me that, well, my direct question is, do you know of any institutions, governments, academics, corporations that are seriously calculating their footprint from food consumption?
No, I don't. Right. And it's food. I like to say it's the holy cow right now that can't be touched. Agriculture is, and it's almost wholly the cow's fault too. So.
So I was just online as you were talking, looking at what free calculators there are, and there's a bunch of them out there on food calculators. But I don't know if any of them are any good. Have you or your students ever looked at these?
I don't know how good they are either,
yeah.
And we're trying to do some of our own that are more focused on the issues we are concerned about. But I might point out, local food is a wonderful thing that's gotten people concerned about food. But only about 2% of the greenhouse gas attributable to food comes from its transport. The vast majority of greenhouse gas is from the nitrogen fertilizer, et cetera, not the transport.
Yeah. Well, at least the calculators, I put in some fake diets, and you're right, the transportation is small compared to the production has always been showing up much larger.
Yeah, this is for Dave. Dennis Devlin with ExxonMobil. I'm assuming that your analysis doesn't include much regarding the use of genetically modified organisms. And I'm wondering if that analysis has ever been done, or if you've given that some thought, and if GMOs were developed and broadly used and accepted globally, would that make a very significant difference to your analysis and projection, or not so much?
That's a good question. I have analyzed some of the data. Some of it is a bit proprietary, but USDA kindly provides quite a bit. GMOs provide a variety of benefits. For instance, the varieties that have the BT, Bacillus thuringiensis gene in them are resistant to a variety of pathogenic attack insects and so on, which means that they can be grown without having pesticides used that are specific to those attacks, and that can actually have a big environmental benefit, net benefit. But on the yield side, our current GMOs are not yielding anything more than the non-GMOs. There has not been a yield bump. In fact, my analyses of corn through about 3 years ago was that yields were about 1% lower from GMO corn than from standard corn. And having talked with some breeders about it, they say that this is pretty well known, and it comes about because you have to first breed any crop to stay ahead of evolving diseases. If you grew the corn seed from 10 or 20 years ago, it won't be very good because its defenses have been overcome by lots of diseases. And once you have then bred it to overcome the current evolving diseases, you then have to put in the GMO trait. And that adds about another year to the life cycle before you can actually be selling it as seed, and that causes a slightly lower yield than the variety that could be sold without adding it. So there are costs and benefits for them. Ease of growing, if you have Roundup Ready crops, right? You control weeds very easily until resistance evolves, which is happening, of course. Everything evolves resistance to anything we try to do to it. It's just the way of the world. But right now, GMO crops, from what they've done, my answer would be no. In the longer term, 60 or 70% of the world, 70% of our food supply depends upon 4 crops: corn, wheat, rice, and soybeans. We have those things growing in monoculture all around the world. Monocultures are the beloved target of new diseases. And staying ahead of diseases is going to be critical if we're going to have a stable global food supply. And I think that the genetic modification has the potential to allow us to move in many, many more genes that will allow crops to become resistant to novel varieties of pathogens as they come into being. So I think in the long term, it's going to be a very important tool in our approach to keeping food sustainable.
So do we have any other questions, comments? We've got one more?
One more.
Please.
Just to keep it going, Steve.
Of course.
Walmart has announced that it is only going to be selling sustainable seafood. Walmart has announced it's only going to be selling sustainable seafood. And I'm curious, do you think it can do that in fact?
Walmart is the largest largest seafood retailer in the world, right? So if they're a market mover, right? The real question is, what are they going to source? And already we have a substantial source in tilapia and a few other species, basa from Vietnam and other species, to the extent that their processes are certified as Marine Stewardship Council might do under an aquaculture protocol, depending on the criteria that are applied, possibly so. The real issue is going to be, how stringent are those criteria? From wild source, I mean, the largest food fishery in the world is Bering Sea walleye pollock. It's already 100% subscribed, so if they're going to source only sustainable, and they're going to compete in the market, which is going to drive up the prices of sustainably caught and put more pressure on groups like the Stewardship Council to certify more and more fisheries. And so therein, hopefully lies a positive feedback in achieving that. We'll see. I mean, it's going to be a very difficult road for them, only because of the supply issues. There's a large restaurant chain called Darden, which is Olive Garden and Red Lobster and all that. Their projections of seafood, requirements are enormous, and already that chain is having difficulties in supplying their needs. It's going to be a very difficult and probably politically taxing scenario to achieve the levels of sustainability that clearly consumers want.
I think the other thing you're going to see with that, because I've been on an MSC certification panel, we have a local fish that looks like it's going to certify striped bass in Maryland, may be going through the process successfully. But when you certify a fish, you're typically raising the cost to the consumer. It certainly helps the harvester, but it also raises the cost to the consumer, which again alleviates a good source of protein for people who have less income. And Walmart is serving those people. And I don't see how they can have a sustainable, they can use things like MSC certification, and then hold their prices down.
I make one quick comment.
Yep.
It's interesting to worry about one kind of animal protein being sustainable, but not all the other kinds. Because a huge difference is the difference between beef, pork, chicken, and fish. And in that regards, almost any kind of fish is more sustainable than the other ones are. Right.
So, yeah, Steve, go ahead, and then Martin will get the last word before me.
So I'd like to ask David a question. That is, you know, all of us hobby gardeners are familiar with the growing zones in the United States. And under a climate change scenario, one could imagine those growing zones transitioning northward, right? So, okay, like I say. So has that factored into any of these calculations in terms of sort of net benefits in the United States or potential ecosystem impacts as a different mix of crops, you know, maybe not sustainable given the crop growing regions?
Well, there has been a lot of research on that. I've not done that personally, and much of the research suggests in the short term, global yields will go up because of climate change, and in the longer term, they'll go down. So 10, 20, 30 years of higher yields because of longer growing seasons and warmer conditions, and then too warm and too dry, and problems that way. So, but it's, in the short term is not a big issue. There might be some benefit. In the long term, it could be, in the really long term, if we don't get this system turned around, what we're doing, it could be a major issue because there'll be this disconnect between where climates are good and where soils are good. Soils are created by climate that gives you certain plant ecosystems that are there that create the soil, and if the soils, if the climate moves away from that area to the area that will now have good growing conditions, will likely not have soils that are as good to grow crops on.
We have time?
Please.
Quick question, just you mentioned, David, crop, the yield gap. And something I've seen that I think was elucidated quite well by the tragedy in Haiti surrounding the earthquake is that our aid was to immediately send down, you know, hundreds of tons of rice, so, you know, send down food, send doctors. And in fact, I've heard numerous reports of what we succeeded in doing by that. Yes, we fed an immediate need, but we also put Haitian farmers out of business. By flooding the market with free product, we then made anything of any cost, you know, not feasible. Doctors as well, you know, were put out of business by the fact that such an influx of free services. With foreign aid, specifically food aid, are we engendering that same sort of kind of slow crisis by not associating with really developing self-sustaining systems? I mean, you mentioned the yield gap. And, you know, we've used food aid as a stopgap, as a prop to help stabilize democracies. Is there an externality in sort of foreign aid, foreign security that comes if we were to actually shift some of our crop production methods?
I mean, this is a complex question because I think none of us would say we shouldn't send food to help people who are starving right now.
Certainly.
But I would agree with you, the next logical step would be to help them develop a better approach to agriculture, which let them have higher yields and more sustainable yields through time. And that step, I think, is not what is not the common follow-through to a famine. I mean, famines are viewed as sort of coming from on high, being caused by a hot, dry year or whatever, whereas nations that have better agricultural infrastructure are much less likely to have a famine no matter what their climate zones are. And so I think that there has been a disconnect that way. As far as low commodity prices from some developing high-yielding nations affecting agricultural development, that's probably also true. But the commodity prices for agricultural products aren't as low now as they used to be, so that may be fading away as a force.
Thank you.
Sure.
So let's thank these two panelists, Steve and David, for giving us an outstanding presentation.